On Christmas Eve of 1734, Madrid was settling into the last hours of the day when an alarm spread through the old royal Alcázar. What began as a palace fire became a catastrophe that could be seen across the city. The residence that had served Spanish monarchs for centuries, fortress, court, archive and home, was burning from the inside out. By morning, the Alcázar was gutted, along with irreplaceable collections and records. In Spain, a palace wasn't only rooms and corridors. It was the stage where authority was performed, and at the heart of that performance always was worship. For the Bourbon dynasty, still defining itself in a Spain shaped by earlier Habsburg tradition, rebuilding could not be a simple act of replacement. It had to be a statement. Philip V ordered a new palace on the same strategic promontory above the Manzanares River, and the new structure would be different in one crucial way. It would be built to resist fire. Stone and brick would replace the flammable interiors that had doomed the Alcázar. Construction began in 1738, and the project would extend across decades, completed in 1764, as the Palacio Real de Madrid emerged as one of Europe's largest royal palaces. But even before the facades were finished, the palace was being planned as a machine of ceremony. Every great court relied on controlled movement. Who enters first, who waits, who is seen, who is hidden. In Madrid, that choreography needed a sacred center that could serve daily devotion and dynastic ritual without surrendering control to the unpredictable space of a public cathedral. That is where the palace chapel belongs. It was never meant to be a city church. It was meant to be a court's inner sanctuary, placed within the palace's circulation like a locked chamber of routine power. The first designs for the new palace came from the Italian architect Filippo Juvara, grand and ambitious, shaped by European court tastes. After Juvara's death, Giovanni Battista Sacchetti adapted and realized those plans on the ground in Madrid. The palace that resulted was an enormous rectangle organized around courtyards, with a hierarchy of rooms that moved from guarded thresholds toward the most privileged interiors. In that sequence, the chapel had a specific task: to transform religion into a controlled, royal experience. It needed to be close enough for the sovereign's household to reach without spectacle, yet formal enough to host rites that confirmed the monarchy's identity. This is the first reason the chapel feels hidden. It sits behind the palace's logic of access. In a royal residence, privacy is not absence, it is managed visibility. The chapel was approached through corridors and antechambers where the pace of entry could be slowed, where rank could be sorted in silence. That approach mattered because court worship was not casual. It could involve processions, seating protocols, and the presence of guards and courtiers who did not attend as ordinary believers. They attended as parts of an institution. As the palace interiors developed through the mid-18th century, the chapel became a concentrated expression of the monarchy's intended image. The Bourbons needed to show continuity with Spanish tradition, while also projecting modern royal splendor. The chapel could do both at once. Its architecture and ornamentation announced seriousness rather than theatrical excess, but the scale and finish signaled resources and command. It was a sacred room, yet it operated like a stateroom. The altar as focal point, the monarch's position defined, the space designed to hold sound and movement. That sound, music, was not decoration. Royal chapels sustained formal musical life because sacred music was a language of power at European courts, and Spain's court tradition demanded it. A chapel inside a palace is built for voice and instrument, for controlled acoustics, for choirs and organ, for moments when an unseen congregation beyond the walls of the palace could still feel the weight of monarchy through the rituals it preserved. The chapel did not need a city audience. It needed a court. When you step back, the story of the hidden chapel is not the story of a secret room concealed from history. It is the story of an institution rebuilding itself after a disaster and deciding where the center of gravity would be. The new palace rose from the ashes of the Alcázar with a deliberate promise. The monarchy would endure, order would return, and within those stone walls, worship would remain inseparable from rule. The chapel was designed to make that promise feel permanent, quiet, internal, and controlled, like a steady flame protected from the chaos that had once consumed the old palace in a single night. In a palace, the most revealing spaces are not always the most public ones. The grand staircases and reception halls exist to impress an audience. The chapel exists to regulate an inner world. That is why the Royal Chapel of Madrid is best understood through function, how it was used, how it was approached, how it shaped the court's daily rhythm. The hidden quality is not a rumor, it is structural. A royal chapel is built so that worship can be both intimate and unmistakably hierarchical. By the middle decades of the 18th century, the palace was becoming fully inhabitable as monarchs continued refining its interiors. The chapel's decoration was entrusted to leading figures of the period. Corrado Giaquinto, the Italian painter brought to Spain for major decorative programs, directed and executed fresco work for the chapel and its adjoining spaces. In these painted vaults, the message was never merely devotional. Court chapel iconography consistently bound faith to monarchy, suggesting divine protection, dynastic continuity, and the order of the realm. The imagery didn't need to explain itself in words. In a room designed for controlled access, the audience was already trained to read symbols. Altarpieces and paintings reinforced this same blend of devotion and authority. Works associated with artists like Ramón Bayeu and Anton Raphael Mengs were placed within the chapel's liturgical framework, where their presence could elevate the sacred setting while also declaring the taste and patronage of the crown. In a public church, art must speak to many kinds of people. In a royal chapel, art speaks to one kind of people, those who understand court language, rank, and the idea that the sovereign's piety is part of state identity. The chapel also held objects that anchored that identity in physical terms. Relics, ceremonial furnishings, textiles and metalwork, meant for use, not just display. That practical reality is easy to miss in modern palace tours. A chapel inside a royal residence was equipped for repeated action, services, feast days, court rites. Its lamps were not purely aesthetic. Its seating was not accidental. The placement of the monarch's canopy and chairs was a political geometry drawn into fabric and wood. Even silence had rules. When it began, who could break it? Who could move? Then there is the element that most powerfully transforms a chapel, the organ. In Madrid's royal chapel, an organ built in 1778 by Jordi Bosch became one of the defining instruments of the space. The date matters because it places the organ within a mature phase of 18th century court culture, when the palace's interior life was being refined into a stable ceremonial system. An organ is more than a musical machine. It is architecture that breathes. It fills the chapel with sound that makes the room feel larger, more inevitable, more complete. When the organ speaks, the chapel stops being simply a room inside a palace. It becomes a world. Court music in such a setting is also a form of discipline. It is timed, rehearsed, and aligned with the calendar of worship and monarchy. Musicians attached to royal chapels were part of the household, and their work supported a message the palace needed to project: continuity. In the chapel, the court could enact a version of itself that was both spiritual and official. This was especially important in Spain, where the crown's Catholic identity had long been woven into governance, ceremony, and international posture. The chapel's hiddenness becomes clearer when you imagine the palace functioning at full capacity. Outside, Madrid moves with noise and commerce. Inside, the palace runs on scheduled motion. Guards hold thresholds. Courtiers wait for signals. Doors open at the correct moment, not before. In that system, the chapel is a controlled destination. The court could enter as a body and be arranged as a hierarchy before a single prayer was spoken. Worship did not erase rank, it displayed it with solemnity. This is why the chapel can feel like a preserved secret, even when it is documented. It was never meant to be stumbled upon. It was meant to be reached properly. Its history is not a chain of sensational events, but a pattern of repeated rituals that shaped how the monarchy appeared to itself. The chapel was where the palace's private conscience and public image overlapped, where devotion could be witnessed without becoming democratic, where sacred ceremony could reinforce a vision of Spain with the sovereign at its center. And because so much of that life happened behind controlled doors, the chapel carries a lingering sense that it still belongs, in some part, to the court that built it. When a palace becomes a monument, its rooms change roles. They move from being lived spaces to being interpreted spaces. The Royal Palace of Madrid is now used primarily for state ceremonies rather than daily royal residence. Yet the chapel remains one of the clearest reminders that the building was engineered for a court, not for tourists. The chapel does not become neutral just because history moves forward. It remains a room designed for rules: how to enter, where to stand, what to look at, when to listen. In the modern era, that tension between preservation and use defines the chapel's story. A chapel inside a palace cannot be treated exactly like a museum gallery because it was built for ritual action. Yet, it cannot be treated exactly like a parish church because it belongs to a historic royal complex governed by protocols of conservation and state function. The result is a space that still feels reserved, even when open, because its purpose was never to welcome the crowd in the way a public sanctuary does. Its purpose was to hold the monarchy's inner ceremonial life with precision. The Bosch organ is a perfect example of what survives when function becomes heritage. Built in 1778, it remains a central feature of the chapel's identity, and modern restoration work has kept it playable for concerts and ceremonial occasions. The fact that the instrument still performs matters. It keeps the chapel from becoming purely visual. When the organ is heard, the room resumes its original behavior. It becomes a chamber for listening, not simply looking. Sound restores the chapel's 18th century intent more quickly than any wall label or guidebook ever could. And there have been recent efforts to make the chapel's living character visible again. Patrimonio Nacional, which manages key royal sites in Spain, has held organ cycles and concerts in the royal chapel, using the space not merely as a preserved relic, but as an active venue aligned with its historic purpose. In doing so, the chapel becomes a bridge between centuries. The same vault that once absorbed court music now holds modern audiences in the same disciplined stillness that court etiquette once demanded. Yet, as the chapel remains active, it also carries traces of the 20th and 21st centuries that complicate its older meaning. The chapel has been used for significant rites connected to the royal family, including funerary ceremonies and memorial services that turn the palace inward again, if only briefly. In those moments, the palace stops behaving like a monument and resumes behaving like a residence of state, where private grief and public symbolism share a single space. The chapel, by design, is where that overlap is most natural. This is another way the chapel stays hidden, not because its doors cannot be opened, but because much of its meaning appears only during rare occasions. A visitor can see the altar, the frescoes, the organ, and the arrangement of the room. But the chapel's full identity is revealed when it is used as intended, when people enter with purpose, when sound fills the air, when the room becomes a sequence of actions rather than an exhibit. The difference is subtle but profound. A museum space is complete when it is looked at. A chapel is complete when it is performed. Preservation also introduces its own invisible layer. Restorations, lighting improvements, conservation decisions. These are modern acts that keep the room legible and safe, but they also shape how the chapel is experienced. When new lighting is installed, it changes how gold and marble read to the eye, how paintings emerge from shadow, how the space guides attention. These adjustments can be technical, yet they affect atmosphere, and atmosphere is part of what makes the chapel feel separate from the palace's more openly public rooms. The chapel's mood, its controlled brightness, its measured shadow, has always been part of how it communicates authority. Still, the deepest hiddenness is not architectural. It is historical. Much of what happened in the chapel was routine, and routine is rarely described with the detail later generations want. We can document the palace's rebuilding after the 1734 fire, the start of construction in 1738, the completion in 1764, the architects involved, the artists commissioned, the organ built in 1778, and the way the palace is used for state ceremonies today. What is harder to recover is the lived choreography. Who waited in what corridor before a service? How the court arranged itself in silence? What was whispered behind a door before the monarch appeared? How the sound of the organ timed the movement of a procession. Those details, if they were recorded at all, often remain scattered, partial, and locked inside the habits of a vanished court. That is the unresolved intrigue the chapel leaves behind. It offers evidence, but it also withholds the full performance. You can stand where the court once stood, look up at the painted vaults designed to bind faith and monarchy together, and hear an instrument built to command the room with a single sustained chord. But you cannot fully restore the invisible rules that once governed every step. The chapel remains, in the most enduring sense, an interior space inside an interior world. Proof that the palace was never only built to be seen, but to be controlled, enacted, and remembered on the monarchy's terms.